2 decades ago, a nonprofit organization began trying to fix that, not with a new national park, but rather a huge, privately operated nature reserve.
Texas, a land defined by its legends, its oil, and its uncompromising heat. But in the summer of 2011, Texas stunned the world by announcing a plan many called ecological self-destruction. They were releasing a legendary herd of Southern Plains Bison into the unforgiving red rock wasteland of Caprock Canyons. Critics laughed, predicting the animals would starve in a desert that couldn't even support a mouse. They said Texas was playing God with a dead species. But as the dust settled, the laughter stopped. What followed was a biological transformation so radical, it forced scientists to rewrite the rules of conservation. This is the story of the ghost herd, and the truth will stun you. The Great Silence, the death of the Southern Plains. The Texas Panhandle is a place of haunting beauty, a landscape defined by its horizontal infinity and the relentless, scouring wind. But if you had stood on the edge of the Caprock Escarpment in the year 1870, the sound you would have heard was not the wind. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the soles of your boots, a sound often described by early travelers as a distant, never-ending thunder. This was the sound of the Southern Plains Bison. At that time, an estimated 30 to 60 million of these prehistoric titans roamed the heart of North America, their migration routes forming the very veins and arteries of the continent's ecology. They were more than just animals. They were a biological force of nature that dictated where the grass grew, where the water flowed, and how the very soil beneath them breathed. Yet, in one of the most rapid and calculated environmental catastrophes in human history, the thunder was silenced. Between 1870 and 1880, a period of just 10 years, the Great Plains were turned into a graveyard. This wasn't merely the result of overzealous hunting or the expansion of the frontier. It was a deliberate scorched earth policy. General Philip Sheridan and other military leaders recognized that the bison were the primary commissary for the indigenous tribes of the Plains, the Comanche, the Kiowa, and the Cheyenne. By eliminating the bison, the government could effectively dismantle the sovereignty of these nations without firing a shot in traditional combat. The strategy was brutally efficient. Hide hunters, armed with long-range sharps rifles, moved across the plains like a mechanical scythe. They took the hides, sometimes the tongues, and left millions of tons of meat to rot in the Texas sun. By the mid-1870s, the plains were littered with thousands of bones that were said to resemble a landscape covered in unseasonal snow. These bones were eventually gathered by the wagon load and shipped east to be ground into fertilizer or used in the refining of sugar, leaving the land stripped of its nutrients and its soul. The ecological impact was immediate and devastating. Without the bison to graze the tall grasses, the prairie began to choke on its own dead matter. Without their heavy hooves to break the soil, the ground became a sun-baked brick that repelled rainwater. The Great Silence had begun, and as the last of the wild herds vanished into the canyons to hide, the world assumed the Southern Plains bison were gone forever, a casualty of progress and war. The disappearance of the bison didn't just leave a hole in the landscape. It fundamentally altered the climate and the chemistry of Texas. The diverse mosaic of wildflowers and varied grass heights vanished, replaced by a monotonous, fragile sea of brush and invasive species. The predators, the wolves, and the grizzly bears followed the bison into oblivion. The rivers, once kept clear by the bison's movement, began to silt up. For over a century, this silence persisted, a reminder of a lost world that many believed could never be restored. The Texas Panhandle became a place of cattle and cotton, a landscape tamed by fences and irrigation, while the memory of the great herds faded into the realm of myth and old photographs. But in the quietest corners of a private ranch, a small heartbeat remained. 5 calves and a prayer. To understand the weight of what was recently achieved in the canyons of Texas, one must look back to the late 1870s, to a time when the dust of the Great Slaughter had not yet settled. In the heart of the Palo Duro Canyon, a legendary cattleman named Charles Goodnight and his wife, Mary Ann, were witnessing the end of an era. Charles was a man of the frontier, a scout and a rancher who had seen the plains when they were black with bison. He knew better than most that the disappearance of the buffalo was a harbinger of a deeper, more permanent change to the American West. But while Charles saw the strategic and economic shifts, it was Mary Ann who heard the emotional toll of the extinction. As the hide hunters finished their grim work on the edges of the Goodnight Ranch, Mary Ann began to hear a sound that haunted her sleep. The desperate, high-pitched bawling of orphaned bison calves. These young animals were the leftovers of the massacre, too small to provide a valuable hide and left to starve or be picked apart by coyotes next to the carcasses of their mothers. Mary Ann, moved by a profound sense of maternal compassion and a recognition of the unfolding tragedy, pleaded with her husband to intervene. She understood that if someone did not act immediately, the specific bloodline of the Southern Plains Bison, animals uniquely adapted to the heat, the brush, and the rugged terrain of Texas, would vanish from the face of the earth. In 1878, Charles Goodnight rode out with his lariat and, through a series of grueling and dangerous maneuvers, roped 5 young bison calves. Those 5 animals, 2 bulls and 3 heifers, became the foundation of what would eventually be known as the Goodnight herd. At the time, neighbors and fellow ranchers looked on with a mixture of amusement and pity. They wondered why a man as successful as Goodnight would waste prime grazing land and resources on a useless animal that the rest of the world had moved past. To the cattlemen of the late 19th century, the bison was a relic, a wild nuisance that had no place in the new world of fenced-in steers and industrial agriculture. However, the Goodnights were not merely keeping pets. They were running a desperate private conservation experiment before the word conservation had even entered the common lexicon. For decades, this tiny group of survivors lived within the fences of the J.A. Ranch. They were a biological island, a genetic time capsule protected from the chaos of the outside world. But life on an island is precarious. As the decades rolled into the 20th century, the herd grew slowly, but it remained isolated. Because the population started with only 5 individuals, every birth was a double-edged sword. While each calf represented a victory against extinction, it also deepened the genetic entanglement of the group. By the time the herd was eventually relocated and managed by the state, they were the last of their kind. They carried the unique DNA of the Southern Plains, a genetic code that differed significantly from the northern herds in Yellowstone. They were smaller, more heat-tolerant, and possessed an uncanny ability to thrive on the sparse vegetation of the Texas Panhandle. Yet, they were also fragile. They were the descendants of a prayer made by Mary Ann Goodnight, a legacy kept alive by the sheer will of a few individuals who refused to let the fire go out. For over 100 years, these animals lived as paddock buffalo, fed by human hands and sheltered from the true wild. Survival, however, came with a hidden price that threatened to end the lineage forever. A species on life support. By the mid-90s, the weight of history was crushing the descendants of the Goodnight herd. When the J.A. Ranch and the heirs of the Goodnight legacy finally donated the animals to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department in 1997, the state realized they hadn't just inherited a herd, they had inherited a crisis. Scientists and veterinarians rushed to the Palo Duro to assess the health of these living relics, and what they found was a biological warning light flashing red. The herd had spent over a century in a state of extreme genetic isolation, and the consequences of being descended from just a handful of individuals, a phenomenon known as a genetic bottleneck, were finally coming to a head. Inbreeding is the silent killer of small populations. In the wild, animals have the freedom to roam hundreds of miles, crossing paths with different groups and ensuring a constant flow of fresh DNA. This genetic diversity is a species' primary defense mechanism against disease, environmental shifts, and physical deformities. But for the Texas state bison herd, the walls of the ranch had become a cage for their DNA. DNA testing revealed a staggering lack of diversity. The animals were becoming mirrors of one another, and as a result, their survival instincts and physical robustness were beginning to fray. The data was grim. Birth rates were plummeting. Many of the calves being born were weak, and a significant number of cows were unable to carry their young to term. More alarming was the discovery that the herd's immune systems were becoming dangerously compromised. A single outbreak of a common bovine disease, which a healthy wild herd would have brushed off with ease, now had the potential to wipe out the entire Southern Plains lineage in a matter of weeks. The ghost herd was fading, not from hunters' rifles this time, but from the simple, cold mathematics of biology. Experts from around the country were brought in to consult on the Texas problem. Some suggested that the herd was already too far gone, that the Southern Plains Bison was a dead branch on the tree of life. They recommended genetic swamping, which would involve bringing in hundreds of bulls from the massive Yellowstone herds to breed out the goodnight traits. While this would save the animals, it would effectively erase the very thing that made them special: their 10,000-year-old adaptation to the Texas heat and the specific grasses of the Panhandle. To the Texas biologists, that wasn't an option. They wanted to save the bison, but they also wanted to save the Texas bison. They were trapped in a paradox. If they kept the bison in the safety of their current ranch, they would continue to inbreed and eventually vanish. If they moved them to a wilder, more aggressive environment to stimulate natural selection, the animals, weakened by years of domesticated ranch life, might not survive the transition. It was a high-stakes game of biological poker. The state was at a crossroads. Continue the status quo and watch the herd slowly flicker out, or take a massive, unproven gamble by placing these fragile survivors into one of the most rugged landscapes in North America. If the herd was going to survive, Texas had to do the unthinkable: stop protecting them and start making them wild again. Releasing the Titans. The decision to move the herd from the relatively flat, predictable pastures of their traditional ranching grounds to the jagged, vertical labyrinth of Caprock Canyons State Park was met with an immediate wave of skepticism. To the uninitiated, the Caprock looks like a landscape designed to reject life. It is a world of sharp, red clay drop-offs, shifting gypsum soils, and dense thickets of mesquite and prickly pear. For over a century, the goodnight bison had been treated like prized museum exhibits, fenced in, supplemented with hay during the lean winter months, and sheltered from the true volatility of the Texas wilderness. The critics were loud and persistent. Moving these domesticated relics into the canyons wasn't a conservation strategy. It was an execution. In 2011, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department ignored the laughter and the warnings, and the Caprock gamble officially began. The logistics were a nightmare. Moving a 1,000-pound animal that hasn't evolved to be handled by humans is a feat of engineering and nerves. Dozens of bison had to be corralled, medically cleared, and loaded into heavy-duty trailers for the journey across the Panhandle. When the trailers finally backed up to the red dust of the canyons, there was a palpable sense of dread among the biologists. Would these animals, weakened by decades of inbreeding and soft living, know how to navigate a 200-foot cliff? Would they find the hidden freshwater seeps in a land that hadn't seen a bison's tongue in 130 years? The moment the heavy steel gates swung open, the silence of the canyons was shattered. The bison didn't tentatively step out into their new home. They exploded. In a scene that looked like a blurred photograph from the 19th century, the great bulls charged into the brush, their hooves kicking up clouds of red dust that hung in the air like a localized storm. But the real test wasn't the release. It was the first winter. The Caprock is famous for blue northers, sudden Arctic blasts that can drop the temperature by 40 degrees in an hour, accompanied by skin-stinging sleet and howling winds. Many expected the herd to huddle in the valley floors and starve, waiting for a hay truck that was never coming. Instead, something primally Texas began to wake up inside them. To the astonishment of the observers, the bison didn't struggle. They adapted with a speed that defied modern biological expectations. They began to use their massive muscular necks to plow through the scrub, finding the nutrient-dense grasses hidden beneath the frost. They navigated the treacherous, honeycomb breaks of the canyons with the grace of mountain goats, moving into the high country during the day and descending into the thermal protection of the canyons at night. They weren't domesticated animals at all. They were ancient spirits that had simply been waiting for the fences to fall. The skeptics had been looking at the bison as a liability, a species that needed to be saved by humans. They failed to see that the bison was a species that could save the land. As the herd began to move through the 15,000-acre park, they didn't just survive the terrain. They began to dismantle the desert that had formed in their absence. The very behaviors that people thought would destroy the park, the heavy trampling, the aggressive grazing, and the constant wallowing, were about to trigger a biological chain reaction that would stun the scientific community. Within weeks, the bison began to behave in ways no living human had ever witnessed. The wallow effect. What happened in the months following the release was not just a biological adaptation. It was an act of landscape architecture performed by a 1,000-pound animal. To the casual observer, a bison wallowing in the dirt looks like nothing more than a giant beast scratching an itch. They throw their massive weight onto their sides, kicking their legs and spinning their humped shoulders into the dry Texas earth, sending plumes of red dust into the air. But as the scientists watching through high-powered lenses at Caprock Canyons soon realized, these dust baths were the first step in a radical environmental restoration project.
Bison in particular behave in a very unique way. They have a very unique ecology. Just roll around in a little sand pit and they create these little dust baths for burrowing invertebrates and burrowing insects. We're hoping to increase the abundance of all the wildlife.
Each time a bison wallows, it creates a shallow, bowl-shaped depression in the ground. Over time, as multiple animals return to the same spot, these depressions become compacted and hardened by the sheer pressure of their weight. In the desert of the Texas Panhandle, the soil is often a sun-baked crust that acts like concrete, causing the rare torrential rains to simply sheet off the surface and race into the gullies, carrying away precious topsoil. But the bison changed the physics of the water cycle. When the thunderstorms finally broke over the canyons, the wallows acted as natural catch basins. Instead of washing away, the water stayed. These wallows transformed into ephemeral wetlands, tiny localized oases scattered across thousands of acres of scrubland. In a landscape that often feels like a kiln, these miniature ponds became the lifeblood of the prairie. They held water for days, or even weeks, after a storm, providing drinking holes for smaller mammals and breeding grounds for amphibians that hadn't been seen in the area in decades. But the stunner was what happened when the water finally evaporated. The bison had effectively tilled the soil without a single piece of machinery. The seeds of native tall grasses, little bluestem, Indian grass, and side oats, grama, had been lying dormant in the parched earth for nearly a century, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. By breaking the soil's cap and providing a concentrated source of moisture, the bison triggered a green explosion. Areas that had been dominated by invasive mesquite and hardy, nutrient-poor brush suddenly began to sprout lush, vibrant grasses. This wasn't a slow transition. It was a biological reset. The bison weren't just eating the landscape. They were gardening it. Their hooves, which are sharp and heavy, acted as natural aerators, pushing seeds deep into the nutrient-rich mud of the wallows and breaking up the root mats of invasive species. This process, known as zoogeomorphology, proved that the desertification of the Texas Panhandle wasn't an inevitable result of climate change, but a symptom of a missing engineer.
Bison are what we call an ecosystem engineer. It means they basically build habitat for other species. There's hundreds of species that rely on the work that bison do as an ecological actor for their own survival.
The critics who laughed at the release had assumed the land was too far gone to support the bison, failing to realize that the land was only gone because the bison weren't there to maintain it. As the grass grew taller and the wallows filled with life, the very color of the canyons began to shift from a dusty, monochromatic red to a shimmering, multi-textured green. But the transformation wasn't just happening in the soil, it was vibrating through the entire food chain. The hidden kingdom, from dung beetles to apex predators. As the native grasses began to reclaim the jagged red slopes of the Caprock, a secondary miracle was unfolding beneath the hooves of the herd, one that was invisible to the naked eye but arguably more profound than the return of the bison themselves. In the century of the bison's absence, the middle of the food chain had hollowed out. The hidden kingdom of insects, soil microbes, and small scavengers had withered away because their primary source of fuel, massive quantities of high-quality processed organic matter, had vanished. But with the return of the Texas state bison herd, the fuel was back. Each animal produces roughly 30 to 50 pounds of waste a day, and in the heat of the Texas sun, that waste became the foundation for a biological gold rush. Almost immediately, species of dung beetles that had been statistically rare or presumed localized began to appear in the canyons by the millions. These beetles are the unsung heroes of the plains. They don't just clear waste. They are master nutrient recyclers. They carve out spheres of bison dung and bury them deep into the soil, effectively injecting nitrogen, phosphorus, and organic carbon directly into the root zones of the prairie grasses. This subterranean labor force turned the desert soil into a sponge, increasing its ability to hold carbon and moisture. But the beetles weren't alone. Their sudden population explosion triggered a massive trophic cascade, a domino effect that pulsed upward through the entire ecosystem. With the beetles came the birds. Grassland birds, many of which are currently facing some of the steepest population declines in North America, found a sanctuary in the Caprock. Species like the scissor-tailed flycatcher and the loggerhead shrike returned in numbers not seen in decades. They weren't just there for the insects, they were there for the bison wool. During the spring rut and shedding season, bison leave behind thick clumps of incredibly insulating fur on the mesquite and juniper bushes. The birds began using this fur to line their nests, significantly increasing the survival rates of their chicks during the volatile spring cold snaps. The bison were providing the food, the shelter, and the climate control for an entire avian generation. Even the predators of the Caprock, the coyotes, the bobcats, and the elusive mountain lions began to change their patterns. They weren't necessarily hunting the bison, they were hunting the abundance that the bison created. More grass meant more rodents meant more snakes and small carnivores. The wasteland was no longer a silent, static museum of red rock. It was a vibrating, noisy, and chaotic theater of life. Scientists who had spent their careers studying the decline of Texas wildlife were stunned to see that by simply reintroducing one keystone species, they had inadvertently repaired 1,000 broken links in the biological chain. The laughter of the skeptics had been replaced by the frantic scratching of notebooks as researchers scrambled to document the speed of the recovery. It was a masterclass in regenerative ecology. The bison had proven that the Earth doesn't always need a $1 million restoration project or a decade of human planting. Sometimes, it just needs the right engineer to get back to work. The ghost herd was no longer a group of animals on life support. They were the architects of a new Texas. As the land turned green, the scientists realized they had unlocked a secret weapon against the changing climate. Bison versus the modern world. As the restoration of the Caprock Canyons progressed, a new and unexpected realization began to dawn on the researchers. The bison were not just a relic of the past, they were a blueprint for a more resilient future. For decades, the Texas Panhandle has been a laboratory for the extremes of a changing climate. It is a land of 1,000-year droughts that occur every decade and 100-year freezes that seem to arrive every other winter. In this volatile theater, the traditional backbone of the Texas economy, commercial cattle ranching, has struggled to keep pace. Cattle, while hardy, are essentially an exotic species in the high plains, requiring vast amounts of pumped groundwater, supplemental grain, and human-built shelters to survive the brutal swings of the thermometer. But the goodnight bison, after a century of being babied behind fences, were proving that their ancient DNA held a climate shield that humans had completely underestimated. In 2021, when a historic Arctic blast known as Snowmageddon paralyzed the state of Texas.
Out of spring, feeling a lot like winter in parts of the country, an Arctic blast sending wind chills as low as the single digits in some areas.
Cattle across the region perished in the thousands. They huddled in corners, succumbed to the wind chill, and starved because they couldn't reach the grass beneath the ice. Yet, in the heart of the Caprock, the bison didn't just survive, they thrived. Their massive humps, which are largely composed of muscle and fat, acted as thermal batteries. Their skin is significantly thicker than that of any cow, and their winter coats are so efficient at trapping heat that snow will sit on their backs without melting. The bison's behavior during these extremes was the real stunner for the agricultural community. While cattle waited for a rancher to bring a tractor and hay, the bison used their massive, triangular heads like biological snowplows. With a side-to-side swinging motion powered by their immense neck muscles, they cleared the frozen crust to reach the nutrient-dense forage hidden below. They didn't need a heated barn or a grain supplement. They were designed by 10,000 years of Texas winters to be self-sufficient. This low-input survival model began to catch the eye of ranchers who had previously laughed at the idea of wild restoration. The climate resilience extended into the blistering summers as well. During heat waves where temperatures soared to 115 degrees, cattle often stop grazing and huddle near water troughs, leading to weight loss and heat stress. The bison, however, has a unique metabolic switch. They can slow their heart rate and respiration, and their dark coats actually provide a layer of protection against UV radiation. They continued to graze in the midday sun, moving across the landscape in a way that prevented any single area from being overgrazed. They were maintaining the health of the soil even during a drought, ensuring that when the rain finally did return, the ground was ready to absorb every drop. The Texas gamble has proven that if we want to protect the landscape from the extremes of the future, we don't necessarily need more technology or more chemicals, we need more biology. The bison were acting as climate engineers, sequestering carbon deep into the roots of the tall grasses they helped grow and maintaining a water cycle that kept the canyons cool. They were a living shield against the desertification of the West, a species that didn't just endure the weather, it managed it. The skeptics were no longer laughing. They were asking how they could get involved. With the ecosystem restored, one final hurdle remained: the fences themselves. The new frontier, 2024, 2026, and beyond. By the spring of 2024 and moving into 2026, the success of the Caprock experiment reached a definitive tipping point that forced the state of Texas to think bigger than ever before. The herd had officially outgrown its original boundaries, proving to the world that 15,000 acres was merely a starting line for a species designed by evolution to roam thousands of miles. In a historic move that silenced any remaining critics, the state recently acquired over 2,200 additional acres of critical high plains territory. This was more than a real estate transaction. It was a mission to effectively break the fences that had constrained the Southern Plains lineage since the desperate days of Charles Goodnight. This massive expansion represents the rematriation of a species. Through groundbreaking partnerships with the Texas Tribal Buffalo Project and various indigenous nations, the bison are finally being returned to their ancestral roles as spiritual and ecological anchors. We are now witnessing the birth of a great Plains of the South, a vast, contiguous corridor where the bison can move with the seasons, just as they did for 10 millennia. The Texas gamble has transitioned from a localized rescue mission into a global blueprint for environmental restoration. It turns out the skeptics were fundamentally wrong. The bison didn't need us to save them from the desert. We needed them to save the desert from us. What started with 5 orphaned calves has scaled into a project that has effectively released thousands of acres of biological potential back into the wild. The stunner isn't just that the bison returned to the Caprock, it's that when they did, they brought the lost heartbeat of the American West back with them, proving that the desert was never a wasteland. It was just waiting for its masters to return. The Texas desert has finally reclaimed its heartbeat. Witness more incredible stories of nature's recovery. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell.